Hey guys, this is Michael, and I'm taking a slight break from the Outsider storyline video because I wanted to give you guys a peek behind the veil, or a look behind the curtain, to reveal a little bit of the Oz behind creating characters. I'm essentially doing this video on this because I sometimes have a tendency to attract people who are creators that may have either difficulty creating characters, supporting characters, or coming up with storylines. One of the pitfalls, I think, majority of the superhero-related shows is that eventually they kind of turn the flagship character into a team-up series with characters all getting abilities. Now, hear me out. I'm not saying that they're all a negative thing, but I am seeing this trend in a lot of different things, especially in video games, such as Gotham Knights or the recently pushed back Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. Typically, I like single-player games that are really, really strong, story-driven things. Basically, I think this is one of the things that actually really elevated the Arkham series, was that they were just basically like, these strong story character driven games. And shows like Arrow in the later seasons, or The Flash, or even Smallville is guilty of this as well. Eventually, I feel like they personally make it where it's like you're losing something, an element of when like the character is not able to kind of stand on his own 2 feet. When it comes to making characters, I usually have a process, and I jot down ideas on a separate Word document. Something that basically is like before you get to the actual official concept list. Usually I'm going to keep this very simple, but it's kind of like a precursor to the concept list, but it's like a pre-concept list, I guess. With this concept list, I typically come up with names of characters, their abilities, sometimes before figuring out the storyline behind the characters. And further down in the document, I'll have like a concept doc, which is basically formatted with a concept number and then a brief summary. So, for example, there is a goddess who is imprisoned due to her radicalized views against men. After being betrayed in ancient times by a god, he vowed to love her for all of eternity and betrayed his vows, running into the arms of another woman. Man was allegedly descent from that god. Through his descendants, she believes basically that all men are destined to basically become violent and are responsible for all human atrocities, and women are essentially just the victims of these fallible creatures. Men wage wars, they rape, they pillage, and they destroy civilizations. And after her radicalization, she is essentially imprisoned by all of the other gods and goddesses. After they died off, she still remained exiled until someone accidentally released her. Coming into the modern day, she is caught up on centuries of horrors perpetrated by men and crimes against women. She decides to continue her plan that will blink all men out of existence, and in an attempt to basically make a woman-led empire out of the earth. She is the last of her pantheon of gods and is immensely powerful, rivaling that of the dark gods in certain ways, especially due to the alien artifact that she actually possesses. She is heavily inspired by Enchantress and is capable of reality warping due to the artifact that I just mentioned previously. Now, that was actually an example of a longer story concept summary. Now, we have also a short one for an example. So this is Concept 40, an ice-based character that was a scientist that started a chemical experiment that was intended to restore the polar ice caps, leads to an accident in which they gain ice powers. So this basically sometimes could really vary. It depends on how much information I think that I have for a story. And I'm not necessarily saying that you guys have to do like a precursor to putting it on your concept list or your character sheet or whatever logs or things that you're going to probably use to keep track of your characters. Some of you guys might actually come up with your own systems and your own way of doing it. I'm actually curious to see what you guys do come up with. So if you do come up with a system or have one, I really do actually want to hear what you have to say in the comment section as far as that goes. But either way, I'm going to move on. Sometimes I also do storyline concepts in this same format, depending on how much I can really actually jot down before ironing out the details for a storyline. So basically, for example, I have one that is called like an Outcast Comics crisis level event. And this concept basically is just the idea of all of the characters joining together for the television series right now. And it's going to be about 10 to 12 episodes spread across the multiple series which will be basically like a crossover where it'll probably be done either during like the summer or an off season, or possibly even like, you know, within the actual series of each of these shows, and be done in that way. So I think it would be really, really cool, or possibly even like a mini series or an animated thing. I just thought that it would be a cool idea, so I just kind of like jotted down inspiration for that. The same thing with Outcast Comics Vigilante War. Now, with Vigilante War, it is heavily inspired by Civil War or Injustice in a lot of ways, but I actually don't know if I want to say it was inspired by Injustice, only because it came way before Injustice. So this is supposed to be like a character that, I mean, a character-driven, like, you know, story where it's one side versus the other, and that's pretty much how that story is supposed to go. I'm gonna definitely cover that later on and dive deeper into what the actual story is, but it's pretty much like the government pitting hero against hero, and that's, like, you know, to put it as basic as possible without making this video longer than it needs to be. More often than not, when I was coming up with ideas for Outsider episodes, I would try to think of them like little promos or trailers or something quick and brief that would be attention grabbing and make people really want to see what would happen next week. They ultimately were like these short trailers, I guess, that were heavily inspired, yes, you guessed it, by Smallville, especially in their mid to later seasons, which, despite it probably seeming like it's dated now, it was a great way to come up with summaries and quick concepts for episodes that I was able to build upon. And as time progresses, you kind of build on those storylines and you figure out what each character is possibly going to be doing, how they could probably be further developed or utilized within each episode, if at all. And it also helps you too to figure out what direction they're going to take for the rest of the season, or for the remainder of even the series sometimes, depending on how pivotal that moment is. Another thing that I used basically to start writing stories was spicing up basically real life events. So for example, I had a friend once that I was working on Outsider with, and in the early versions of this inception, as a kid, I had an issue with a friend, and this friend and I, we basically stopped speaking to each other. We said that we were going to have nothing to do with each other moving forward. Typically, I wouldn't normally do something like this, but I was like, you know what? I'm not going to go back and rewrite all the stuff that we worked on. Instead, I'm just going to kill off the character. And made a major storyline basically surrounding it. It wasn't anything like, you know, minor. It was a really big deal because the character prior to that was a very big deal. And I felt like it was very deserving that that character had the send-off. The character you guys will basically come to know as Spartan, basically in early drafts, was that my character was supposed to kind of basically pull a Death of Superman and die, and then come back with the help of another character. This character saving Michael would ultimately lead to the death of Spartan, which is basically like a way of kind of like a checks and balance. So characters, usually when they are killed off in Outcast Comics, if you revive them or resurrect them, there's usually a cost, and I wanted it to be that way, so that this way characters weren't just coming back to life, like, you know, all willy-nilly. So moving forward, I started writing and not including the character in future seasons, and I know it sounds really, really petty, but it was basically like, you know, a 7th grader fighting with another 7th grader. So, I mean, like, you know, that's kind of exactly where that went. Ultimately, we wound up, like, you know, resolving things, and I spoke to him and told him that I kind of killed off his character. And he read the story, and I was really like, damn, he's really going to be mad at me for this. And he actually really liked the idea of it, and we wound up working on like a mini series following the resurrection of the character. So it's kind of crazy because it was basically like before the New 52. So I mean, like, the New 52 happened in like 2011, and Final Crisis happened around that time too. But we basically did kind of like what Batman did when he died and wasn't really dead. And obviously, like, you know, this is years before, so, you know, you take what you will from that. But basically then you also have like certain things like characters like Deborah and her storyline and her story arc, which is based off of, like, you know, a family member. or even my brother, who is like, you know, based off of family members. Obviously, these characters have very interesting twists and turns that make for really, really good storylines and aren't necessarily grounded in reality, but you know, they're very much like, you know, laying the groundwork for these massive stories. Some storylines also, honestly, they came into play from like being almost kind of like a fan fiction, because I would sometimes see things and say like, well, I wonder what would have happened if this storyline took a different direction. And I also took notes from other shows like Vampire Diaries, which followed kind of like this rule where worst case scenario, basically, whenever they say that there's something bad that can happen, it always happens. There is no reality where that doesn't happen. Basically, anytime that they mention or introduce a worst case scenario, it is going to happen. And I follow that rule because it makes for very good series finales or even cliffhangers from episode to episode sometimes. I don't like leaving every episode off on cliffhangers, by the way, so you're not going to be seeing, like, you know, cliffhanger after cliffhanger after cliffhanger necessarily. And so I've established this very early on as well, that Outsider was also written as a TV series following me finding out about Smallville. So in a lot of ways, I really tried to follow the format of how Smallville kind of did things, as far as the episode guide, trying to do certain things where it was number, episode title, episode description, and then I would move on and do another episode and another episode and another episode. And typically what I would try to do is I would try to stop it and cap it at 20 for Outsider, because it was easier for me to keep track of when the 100th episode and 200th episode rolled around. And I wanted it also to coincide with the finale of that season, so that the episode would be even bigger and much more monumental in that way. Some of you guys might also be here because you're having a hard time coming up with villains or antagonists for your series or your characters or whatever concepts that you're working on. To condense it as much as possible, because this probably will be too lengthy if I go in on, like, you know, the creation of villains. So what I'm going to pretty much tell you guys is that in the, like, you know, in the comment section, actually, though, if you guys do want me to talk more about villains, I definitely would love to get more into that, and I probably will actually do a separate video on that too, because I mean, that would be way too lengthy to cover just in this video. Basically, I always try to categorize Rogues Gallery in, like, you know, these weird ways where it was like there are these one-off villains or characters that really only kind of appear once, or one and done character that are really minor. They typically don't even have, like, you know, these super powers that are that crazy or that challenging to the character. They're just kind of like this one-off that aren't really that major in that way. So for example, if you're like a Smallville fan, they would be Meteor Freaks, or the Freak of the Week, so to speak. Or if you watch like The Flash or Arrow, it would be characters that appear week to week that aren't really a major threat to The Flash or Arrow. Hell, half of them usually don't even have suits or names that really stand out. So that's pretty much how I would categorize like that first tier of villain. Then you have basically, like, you know, these villains that repeatedly appear, but they're not necessarily like the major threats. They're just characters that kind of show up, and they're like side quests, almost like in a video game. Like, they have their own storylines and their own gimmicks, but they're not necessarily like the main villains or like the major antagonists in, like, you know, the video game. Like, they're not going to make a whole video game around that character necessarily. It might be like a DLC or something like that, if I'm still staying true to, like, you know, the video game analogy. And sometimes they'll, like, you know, have suits or a name or something like that that will, like, you know, still stand out and go along with that gimmick. Then you have your main series villains. These are basically like the characters that are major antithesis of your hero or anti-hero or vigilante or whatever you would want to call them. And basically they're kind of like your Thanos or your Darkseids or something like that, or even big names that really become synonymous with the heroes. Like, you know, when you think about Batman, automatically most people think about Joker. So a lot of times people who are starting out, they kind of try to cut corners when it comes to the villains, but these are typically the characters that are driving the storylines and make things very interesting moving forward. Every villain in some way should kind of reflect the hero or be kind of like a character test that is what would happen if that character actually kind of went the other way, like as far as the hero goes. Like what would happen if that hero, after their tragic events, turned around and basically became the bad guy. Another thing is, when you really think about, like, you know, villains and heroes, you want to think about the idea that characters like Spider-Man or Batman, they are some of the most popular characters. As a matter of fact, I think Spider-Man right now, if I'm not mistaken, when they did a poll, they said he's like the most popular character, comic book character right now. And the whole reason why is because he has a very interesting rogues gallery that really, like, you know, elevates him. Same with Batman. And so that's why I think that the rogues gallery and the villains are very, very important. But either way, I'll cover this more in detail later on, as far as, like, you know, the villains and stuff, because I always find it very interesting to talk about the villains. Pretty much villains that I would establish in the season would be based off of characters that I felt were good for a main season villain. And they were basically, like, written where there were episodes around them, and the finale could kind of build to this epic and major climax in the storyline. And then layer it basically from there, figuring out what other characters would be doing, what other characters would appear, and ideas surrounding the supporting characters and side plots. So basically, from that point forward, what I want to like, you know, say is that if you do start working on characters, or if you are doing certain things like that, don't sleep on the villains, because they really do kind of elevate whatever it is. And a lot of times people actually now like the villains more than even the heroes sometimes, so you can never go wrong with making a really, really interesting villain. I think I basically covered everything. If I did forget anything, I'm probably gonna go back and, like, you know, remaster or rework on this video. But with that being said, I'm gonna bring this video to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed. Like, comment, subscribe, and make sure that you hit that bell so that you never miss out on any Outcast Comics content. And I hope this really did help you guys creating characters or whatever it is that you're working on in your storylines or whatever you're doing. Please let me know in the comment section if you guys are working on characters, or if anybody's doing any stuff like that. I really want to know if this actually helped or did anything for you. Peace.